When Donald and Dorothy first moved into their new neighborhood, they felt like they had found their forever home. It was a quaint suburb surrounded by tree-lined streets where children played safely on sidewalks and neighbors greeted each other with friendly waves. For the couple, it was everything they had dreamed of, a safe haven where they could raise their two young children, Beverly and Ben. The house itself was modest but perfect, a two-story colonial with a backyard spacious enough for a garden, a swing set, and room to run. But paradise quickly turned sour when they encountered Mr. Harold Cooper, the president of the local homeowners association. Donald remembered their first interaction vividly. It was their second day in the house, and they were unpacking boxes when the doorbell rang. Standing on their porch was Cooper, a stocky man in his late 50s, with a clipboard in one hand and an air of authority that felt more oppressive than welcoming. "Good afternoon," Cooper began, his voice devoid of warmth. "I'm Harold Cooper, the president of the Homeowners Association. Just wanted to drop off a copy of the community guidelines." He thrust a thick booklet into Donald's hands before continuing. "I like to ensure all residents are familiar with our rules. Keeps things running smoothly, you understand?" Donald nodded politely, though the encounter left him uneasy. The booklet was more like a manual, filled with pages of restrictions on fence heights, acceptable paint colors, and even the types of flowers allowed in front yards. Donald made a mental note to skim through it later, but life got busy with unpacking, settling in, and adjusting to their new routines. A week later, the first letter arrived. It was an official-looking envelope marked with the Homeowners Association logo, and inside was a courtesy notice informing them that their trash cans had been left visible from the street outside of collection hours, a violation of Section 3.51 of the guidelines. At first, Donald laughed it off. The cans had been there for all of 24 hours after their first trash pickup, and they were still in the process of organizing the garage. He assumed it was a mistake or perhaps an overzealous application of the rules. But the notices kept coming. One week it was about their lawn, which Cooper claimed had grown too tall by a half-inch. The following week it was about the temporary basketball hoop Donald had set up for Ben. It needed to be taken down immediately, as it was unsightly and not in compliance with aesthetic standards. What started as a mild annoyance soon turned into a pattern of harassment. Cooper seemed to be watching their every move. One Saturday morning, Donald was working in the garage when Cooper strolled up the driveway uninvited. "Mr. Barton," he began, tapping his clipboard for emphasis, "I noticed your driveway has some cracks in it. You'll need to have that repaired within 30 days. It's a tripping hazard and reflects poorly on the neighborhood." Donald, sweaty from the morning's work, stood up and brushed off his hands. "Harold, with all due respect, the cracks are barely visible. They're not a hazard." Cooper's smile was thin and condescending. "It's not about whether you think it's a hazard. It's about maintaining standards for the community. If you don't address it, I'll have to issue a formal violation which could lead to a fine." "That's ridiculous," Donald retorted, his patience wearing thin. "We just moved in. I'm already dealing with a list of things to fix inside the house." "Well," Cooper replied, raising an eyebrow, "perhaps you should have considered that before buying a home in an homeowners association-governed community." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Donald fuming. Over the next few months, Cooper's behavior escalated. It became clear that he was targeting Donald's family specifically. Other neighbors had minor violations, a faded mailbox here, a lawn ornament there, but none seemed to receive the same level of scrutiny. Dorothy even overheard Cooper gossiping with another homeowners association board member during a community event, referring to their family as the new problem resident. The breaking point came when Donald received a fine for parking his truck in the driveway overnight. It was an old pickup he used for weekend DIY projects, and while it wasn't shiny and new, it was far from an eyesore. The letter claimed it violated the Homeowners Association's rule against commercial vehicles in driveways. Fed up, Donald decided to confront Cooper directly. He showed up at the next Homeowners Association meeting, which was held in the clubhouse at the neighborhood park. The room was filled with neatly dressed board members sitting at a long table, with Cooper at the center, presiding over the meeting like a king on his throne. When it was Donald's turn to speak, he laid out his grievances calmly but firmly. "Mr. Cooper," he began, "I understand the need for rules, but this has gone too far. You've fined me for petty infractions, some of which aren't even violations. It feels like my family is being unfairly targeted." Cooper didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Mr. Barton, the rules are in place for a reason. If you're unable or unwilling to follow them, perhaps this isn't the right community for you." Doyle's frustration boiled over. "We moved here to raise our kids in a safe, supportive environment, not to be bullied by someone on a power trip." At that, Cooper finally looked up, his expression cold. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced abruptly, banging his gavel. "If you have further issues, you can take it up with the Homeowners Association lawyer." As the room emptied, several neighbors whispered words of encouragement to Donald, expressing their own frustrations with Cooper's leadership, but none were willing to stand up to him directly. "He's vindictive," one woman whispered. "He'll make your life a nightmare." Donald left the meeting with a sinking feeling. It was clear that Cooper wasn't going to back down, and the system was designed to protect him. For the first time, Donald began to wonder if moving into the neighborhood had been a mistake. The night began like any other for Donald and Dorothy. After putting their two young children, Beverly and Ben, to bed, they settled into their usual routine. Dorothy flipped through a magazine on the living room couch, while Donald reviewed some work emails on his laptop. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. It was the kind of peaceful evening they had envisioned when they first moved into the neighborhood. That peace was shattered around 10:30 p.m. when Donald noticed a faint movement on the security camera feed displayed on his phone. The family had recently installed cameras around the property after a series of unsettling interactions with Harold Cooper, the Homeowners Association president. Donald clicked on the live feed, and his heart skipped a beat. There, in the glow of the backyard floodlight, was Cooper himself, walking slowly along the fence line with a flashlight. "Dorothy," Donald said, his voice low but urgent. Dorothy looked up, sensing the tension. "Cooper is in our backyard." "What?" she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why would he—" "I don't know," Donald cut her off, rising from his seat, "but I'm going to find out." He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the back door, his phone still streaming the live camera feed. As he opened the door, the cool night air hit him, and he stepped onto the patio. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice carrying through the quiet neighborhood. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Cooper froze, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the lawn before landing on Donald. Instead of looking startled or apologetic, Cooper smirked and casually waved the flashlight in his direction. "Just checking for any violations," Cooper called back, his tone dripping with condescension. "Homeowners Association business." "This is private property," Donald yelled, anger rising in his chest. "You have no right to be here. Get off my land." Cooper took a few steps closer, ignoring Donald's demand. "I have every right to ensure compliance," he said smugly. "Your backyard is visible from the street, and I noticed some irregularities. Thought I'd take a closer look." Donald clenched his fists, his patience hanging by a thread. "Irregularities? Are you kidding me? That's not how this works, Cooper. You're trespassing." Cooper shrugged, his flashlight lingering on the children's swing set. "You should read the Homeowners Association guidelines more carefully, Barton. It's all there. The board has the authority to inspect properties for violations." "Not without my permission, you don't," Donald snapped. He took a step forward, his voice firm and commanding. "This is your last warning. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." For a moment, Cooper seemed to consider his options. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he turned and began walking toward the gate. "Fine," he muttered, though his tone was anything but apologetic. "But don't think this is over. You're not above the rules." Donald watched him go, his fists still clenched. He waited until Cooper had exited through the gate and disappeared down the sidewalk before locking it behind him. His heart was pounding as he returned to the house, where Dorothy was waiting anxiously by the back door. Did he leave? She asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, Donald said, trying to sound reassuring. But he's crossed a line this time. I'm filing a police report first thing in the morning. True to his word, Donald visited the local police station the next day and explained the situation. The officer on duty listened sympathetically and took down the details. Technically, it is trespassing, the officer said, but unless he caused damage or you can prove he entered your home, it's unlikely the DA will pursue charges. We can issue a warning, though. Donald left the station feeling frustrated but determined. He wasn't going to let Cooper intimidate his family any longer. That evening, he installed additional motion sensors and updated the settings on the security cameras to ensure they captured clear footage of anyone entering the property. He also placed several prominent no trespassing signs along the fence line, hoping to make it crystal clear that Cooper wasn't welcome. For a few days, things seemed to settle down. Cooper didn't make any appearances, and Donald began to hope that the warning had worked, but the sense of normalcy was short-lived. One afternoon, Dorothy returned from running errands to find a typed note taped to the front door. The letterhead bore the Homeowners Association logo, and the message was as audacious as it was infuriating. Dear Mr. and Ms. Barton, it began, it has come to our attention that your property may be in violation of several Homeowners Association guidelines. As a courtesy, I personally inspected your backyard to confirm these potential issues. Please note that refusal to address these violations will result in formal action, including but not limited to fines or liens. Sincerely, Harold Cooper, Homeowners Association President. Dorothy's hands trembled as she read the note. She called Donald immediately, barely able to contain her anger. He's claiming that he was doing us a favor by trespassing, she said, her voice shaking. Donald was equally furious. That's it, he said. We're not letting him bully us like this. I'll call a lawyer if I have to. That evening, Donald drafted a formal letter to the Homeowners Association, demanding a written apology from Cooper and threatening legal action if there were any further incidents of trespassing. He sent copies to every board member, ensuring they all knew exactly what had happened. The tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. Other residents began approaching Donald and Dorothy, sharing their own grievances about Cooper. He's been on a power trip for years, one neighbor confided, but no one wants to stand up to him because he'll make your life miserable. Despite their support, Donald felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. Cooper's influence over the Homeowners Association board was strong, and he seemed to relish the conflict. As the days passed, Donald couldn't shake the feeling that Cooper was planning his next move. And he was right. The unease that had been building for weeks finally boiled over one sunny afternoon when Dorothy was home alone with Beverly and Ben. Donald was at work, trying to focus on a presentation for an important client, but his mind kept drifting back to Harold Cooper and the escalating tension in the neighborhood. Around midday, Dorothy was folding laundry in the living room while the children played upstairs. The house was calm, and the rhythmic sound of the washing machine in the background helped her stay relaxed. Then came the knock, loud, sharp, and unrelenting. Startled, Dorothy glanced at the door. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the unmistakable silhouette of Harold Cooper. Her stomach dropped. She hesitated, hoping he might just leave if she ignored him, but the knocking grew louder, more aggressive. "Miss Barton!" Cooper's voice bellowed through the door. "I know you're in there. Open." Dorothy's hands shook as she put down the laundry and approached the door. She could see the determination in his posture and the clipboard tucked under his arm. But it wasn't just his presence. It was the tone of his voice, the way he demanded to be let in, that sent a chill down her spine. "Mr. Cooper," she called through the closed door, trying to sound firm but polite. "What do you want? Donald isn't home." Cooper leaned closer to the door, his face now visible through the glass. "This is official Homeowners Association business," he snapped. "There are ongoing violations that need to be addressed immediately. I need access to the backyard." Dorothy's pulse quickened. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You can't just show up unannounced and demand access to our property," she said firmly. If you have an issue, send it in writing like everyone else. Cooper slammed his palm against the door, making Dorothy jump. I've already sent notices, he growled. Your family has ignored them. This is your final warning, Miss Barton. Let me in or I'll escalate this. His words carried a dark undertone that Dorothy couldn't ignore. Mr. Cooper, please leave, she said, her voice trembling now. If you don't, I'll have to call the police. Cooper's face contorted with rage. You think the police will side with you? He sneered. I'm enforcing the rules. You're the ones breaking them. Before Dorothy could respond, Cooper grabbed the door handle and tried to push it open. Thankfully, the door was locked, but the sheer audacity of his actions sent Dorothy into full panic mode. She quickly stepped back, grabbed her phone, and dialed Donald. Donald, she said, her voice frantic. Cooper is at the door. He's trying to get in. What do I do? Donald's heart sank as he heard her words. Is the door locked? He asked, his voice urgent. Yes, but he's not leaving, Dorothy replied, her voice cracking. He's yelling about violations and demanding to inspect the backyard. Call the police, Donald said immediately. I'm leaving work now. Stay away from the door and make sure the kids are safe. Dorothy nodded, hanging up and dialing 911. As she spoke to the dispatcher, Cooper continued pounding on the door, his voice growing louder and more unhinged. You can't hide forever, he shouted. This neighborhood has rules, and you're not above them. The dispatcher assured Dorothy that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. She ushered the kids into a closet upstairs, telling them to stay quiet and wait for her to return. Her heart ached as she saw the fear in their eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm. Meanwhile, Cooper moved from the front door to the side gate. Dorothy heard the sound of the latch being rattled, then a loud thud as he tried to force it open. She peeked through the curtains and saw him climbing over the fence, his clipboard abandoned on the ground. He was now inside their backyard. The sight of Cooper trespassing yet again, this time with such blatant disregard for boundaries, sent Dorothy's adrenaline into overdrive. She locked the back door and grabbed the baseball bat Donald kept by the kitchen door. She hoped she wouldn't need it, but felt safer holding something in her hands. Get out of here, she yelled through the glass. The police are on their way. Cooper ignored her, pacing around the yard like he owned the place. He pointed at the swing set, the garden, and the freshly mowed lawn, muttering to himself. Then he turned and marched toward the back door, his expression dark. When he reached the door, he leaned in close, his face inches from the glass. You think you can scare me with the cops? He said, his voice eerily calm. You're the ones in the wrong. You're the ones disrespecting this community. Leave, Dorothy screamed, clutching the bat tightly. This is your last warning. Cooper didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crowbar. Dorothy's blood ran cold. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. She couldn't believe this was happening. How had things escalated to this point? As Cooper began prying at the door frame, Dorothy ran upstairs to check on the kids. They were still huddled in the closet, tears streaming down their faces. It's okay, she whispered, trying to sound reassuring. Daddy's on his way, and the police will be here soon. Just as she was about to head back downstairs, she heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Her heart stopped. Cooper had broken the back door and was now inside the house. Dorothy's mind raced. She had done everything she could to keep her family safe, but now the threat was inside their home. She grabbed her phone and called Donald again, her hands trembling. He's in the house, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. He broke the door. I'm almost there, Donald replied, his voice shaking with fear and anger. Stay with the kids. Don't engage him. Dorothy nodded, hanging up and holding her breath as she heard Cooper's heavy footsteps downstairs. He was muttering to himself, his tone growing more agitated with each word. This is what happens, he snarled. This is what happens when people think they're above the rules. Dorothy tightened her grip on the bat, praying that help would arrive before Cooper made it upstairs. Donald's heart raced as he pulled into the driveway. The sight of the shattered glass glinting under the afternoon sun was a jarring confirmation of Dorothy's frantic phone call. He threw the car into park, grabbed the small safe in the trunk where he kept his legally registered firearm, and sprinted toward the house. Inside, Harold Cooper was moving through the living room with calculated menace. His crowbar glinted in the dim light as he muttered under his breath, seemingly oblivious to the wreckage he was leaving behind. A shattered lamp lay in pieces near the couch, and picture frames hung askew on the walls. Upstairs, Dorothy crouched in the closet with Beverly and Ben, trying to stifle their sobs as she whispered reassurances they barely believed. "Where are you, Bartons?" Cooper's voice boomed, sending a chill through the house. "You think you can defy me? Think again." Donald crept toward the front door, his movements careful and deliberate. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He'd spent years training at a local gun range, always believing in the importance of being prepared for the worst while hoping it would never come to that. Now, that preparation felt more critical than ever. "Cooper!" Donald yelled, his voice firm and commanding as he stepped inside. His tone was measured, masking the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. "Drop the crowbar and get out of my house. Now!" Cooper froze, turning slowly to face Donald. His expression shifted from surprise to defiance, a twisted smirk spreading across his face. "Finally decided to show up, huh?" he sneered. "You're too late. This is homeowners association business. I have every right to be here. Breaking into my home isn't homeowners association business," Donald snapped, keeping his firearm pointed low but steady. "I'm giving you one chance to leave before this gets worse." Cooper laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed through the house. "You don't scare me, Barton. You think you can just ignore the rules, disrespect this community? There are consequences for people like you." Donald took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Cooper. "The only person facing consequences here is you. The police are on their way. Put the crowbar down and leave." But Cooper didn't move. Instead, he tightened his grip on the crowbar and took a step toward Donald. "You think you're the hero?" he growled. "You don't belong here. People like you ruin everything. You don't follow the rules and you make me look weak. That ends today." The shift in Cooper's tone sent a wave of dread through Donald. This wasn't just a power-hungry homeowners association president anymore. This was a man unhinged, driven by an obsessive need for control. Donald's instincts screamed at him to de-escalate, but Cooper's growing agitation made it clear that reasoning with him wasn't an option. "Don't do this, Cooper," Donald said, his voice steady but firm. "You're trespassing, and you're armed. Put the crowbar down before you get yourself hurt." But Cooper lunged. It wasn't a calculated move, more of a desperate, reckless attack fueled by rage. He swung the crowbar with surprising speed, forcing Donald to step back to avoid the blow. The impact missed by inches, crashing into the wall and leaving a deep dent. "Stop!" Donald shouted, his voice ringing through the house. "This is your last warning." Cooper ignored him, raising the crowbar for another swing. Time seemed to slow as Donald's training took over. He raised his firearm, aiming for Cooper's shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening, reverberating through the small space. Cooper staggered, the crowbar clattering to the floor as he clutched his shoulder. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining the fabric as he collapsed to his knees. For a moment, the house was silent, except for Cooper's labored breathing and the faint hum of the security system's alarm, triggered by the broken window. Donald kept his firearm trained on Cooper, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Stay down," Donald ordered, his voice calm but authoritative. "The police are on their way." Upstairs, Dorothy heard the gunshot and clutched Beverly and Ben tightly, her heart pounding. She pressed her ear to the closet door, straining to hear what was happening. When Donald's voice rang out, steady and strong, a wave of relief washed over her. She whispered to the children that it was safe now, though her trembling hands betrayed her own lingering fear. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder until flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street. Officers entered the house cautiously, their weapons drawn. Donald immediately set his firearm on the ground and raised his hands, explaining what had happened. "He broke in," Donald said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "He threatened my family. I had no choice." The officers moved quickly, securing the scene and tending to Cooper, who was still conscious but visibly weakened. Paramedics arrived shortly after, loading him onto a stretcher, while an officer stayed behind to take Donald's statement. Dorothy and the children emerged from their hiding place, tears streaming down their faces as they ran to embrace Donald. "It's over," Donald whispered, holding them close. "You're safe now." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The police reviewed the security footage, which clearly showed Cooper breaking into the house and wielding the crowbar. The lead investigator assured Donald that he had acted in self-defense and that no charges would be filed against him. "You did everything right," the officer said. "This could have ended much worse if you hadn't acted." As the paramedics drove Cooper away, neighbors began gathering outside, murmuring in shock and disbelief. Many of them had their own grievances with Cooper, but none had imagined he was capable of such violence. The incident sent shockwaves through the community, raising questions about how someone like Cooper had been allowed to wield so much power for so long. Inside the house, Donald and Dorothy sat together on the couch, holding each other tightly. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them both shaken but grateful to be alive. Beverly and Ben had finally fallen asleep upstairs, exhausted from the day's events. "We did everything we could," Dorothy said quietly, her voice breaking, "but I still can't believe it came to this." Donald nodded, his jaw tight. "He crossed the line," he said. "I wasn't going to let him hurt you or the kids. No one has the right to make us feel unsafe in our own home." As the first rays of dawn broke through the shattered window, Donald knew their lives would never be the same. But in that moment, surrounded by his family, he felt a renewed sense of determination. They had faced the worst and come out stronger, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The sun rose over the Barton home, casting a warm glow on the aftermath of the chaos. Inside, the house was still a scene of disarray. Shattered glass from the back door sparkled on the floor, and a jagged dent in the living room wall bore the mark of Harold Cooper's crowbar. Despite the mess, the air felt lighter, as though a dark cloud had lifted. Donald sat at the kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee in his hands. He hadn't slept. His mind replayed the events of the night before, each moment etched vividly in his memory. The sound of Cooper breaking in, the desperate escalation, and the split-second decision to fire. Across from him, Dorothy sat quietly, her hand resting on his arm. She hadn't slept much either. Upstairs, Beverly and Ben were still asleep, their young minds mercifully spared from the full weight of what had happened. The morning news was already buzzing with coverage of the incident. A reporter stood outside the Barton home, gesturing toward the police tape that still cordoned off the yard. "Shocking events unfolded in this quiet suburban neighborhood last night," she said, her tone grave. Homeowners Association President Harold Cooper was shot after allegedly breaking into the home of Donald and Dorothy Barton. Police have confirmed that Cooper is in stable condition and is facing multiple charges, including trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault with a deadly weapon. Donald switched off the television, unable to watch any more. The news only scratched the surface of what had happened, and the speculation from neighbors and commentators felt invasive. But Donald knew this was just the beginning. The legal and social fallout would be significant, and the incident would likely follow their family for years. Later that morning, Detective Carlson arrived to follow up on the investigation. He was a tall man with a calm demeanor that put Donald at ease despite the circumstances. He carried a notebook and a thick folder containing preliminary reports and security camera footage. "Mr. Barton?" Carlson began, taking a seat at the table. "First, I want to thank you for your cooperation last night. Your quick action to contact law enforcement and your willingness to provide evidence made our job much easier. That said, I need to go over a few final details for the record." Donald nodded, gesturing for Carlson to continue. "We've reviewed the security footage, and it's clear that Mr. Cooper was the aggressor," Carlson said. "He forcibly entered your property, wielded a weapon, and refused to leave despite repeated warnings. Your use of force falls well within the state's self-defense laws, particularly under the Castle Doctrine. You and your family were in immediate danger." Hearing those words should have been comforting, but they brought little relief to Donald. He knew he had done what was necessary to protect his family, but the emotional toll was undeniable. "What happens next?" he asked. Carlson glanced at his notes. "Cooper is currently in custody at the hospital under police guard. Once he's discharged, he'll be formally charged and brought before a judge. Given his actions and the evidence against him, it's unlikely he'll avoid significant legal consequences." "And us?" Dorothy asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Are we safe now? Or will this come back to haunt us?" Carlson gave her a sympathetic look. "I won't sugarcoat it. Situations like this can attract attention, media coverage, neighborhood gossip. But from a legal standpoint, you're in the clear. My advice is to focus on your family and let the justice system handle the rest." As Carlson left, Donald felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, he could see the possibility of moving forward, but there was still work to be done. The shattered glass and broken door were physical reminders of the night's events, and Donald was determined to restore a sense of normalcy to their home. Over the next few days, the Bartons worked together to rebuild. Donald repaired the back door and replaced the damaged window, while Dorothy cleaned up the broken glass and rearranged the living room. Friends and neighbors stopped by to offer their support, bringing meals and words of encouragement. One neighbor, an older woman named Carol, shared her own story. "Cooper has been a bully for years," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He fined me for planting flowers that weren't on the Homeowners Association approved list. I didn't fight back. I didn't think I could. But you stood up to him, and for that, we're all grateful." Carol's words were echoed by others in the community. Stories of Cooper's overreach began to surface: unjust fines, threats of foreclosure, and even allegations of misusing Homeowners Association funds. The more people shared, the clearer it became that Cooper's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern of abuse. With this newfound support, Donald decided to take action. He gathered signatures from neighbors to demand an emergency homeowners association meeting. At the meeting, he presented the evidence of Cooper's misconduct, including financial discrepancies and testimonies from other residents. By the end of the night, the board voted unanimously to remove Cooper from his position as president. The neighborhood began to heal. Without Cooper's oppressive leadership, the community found a renewed sense of unity. Residents worked together to rewrite the Homeowners Association guidelines, prioritizing fairness and transparency. Donald was even asked to join the board, though he politely declined, choosing instead to focus on his family. For the Bartons, life slowly returned to normal. Beverly and Ben resumed their playful routines, their laughter filling the house once more. Dorothy found solace in gardening, creating a beautiful backyard oasis that symbolized their resilience. And Donald, though forever changed by the events, felt a profound sense of gratitude for his family's safety. One evening, as they sat together on the back patio, Donald looked around at the peaceful scene. The neatly mowed lawn, the swing set swaying gently in the breeze, and the warm glow of the setting sun. He reached for Dorothy's hand and squeezed it gently. "We made it," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Dorothy smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We did, and we're stronger for it." In the distance, the faint sound of children laughing echoed through the neighborhood, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there is light.